Welcome, Kalimera, Ron Allen, West Street Christian Church, bringing the 13th in a series of short presentations on the Gospel of Mark, tailored, I hope, to address the situation of emergency in which we find ourselves, because Mark told the story of Jesus in such a way as to speak to the emergency of his time, which was actually more serious than the emergency that we face, because it involved the collapse of his culture and the profound question as to what would come next. We are currently in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. I'm not looking at every passage, but I am looking at passages that I think have particular relevance for our staying at home, our questions about COVID-19, our uncertainty about the future. And tonight I want to look at the feeding of the 4,000. You know, there are two versions of this story in the Gospel of Mark: the feeding of the 5,000, which comes a little earlier, and now the feeding of the 4,000. Just by way of a little technical vocabulary, when you have two stories that are so similar, they are almost the same, they're called a doublet. And usually the presence of a doublet means that this theme is very important to the gospel writer. So Mark wants to impress upon people in their emergency setting that the figure of Jesus, as represented in this text, is still at work doing what he is pictured as doing here. And this passage, this text, along with the feeding of the 5,000, has a special reference to the disciples of Christ, our church, because it relates to one of the central practices of our movement, which is taking the loaf and the cup, the Lord's Supper, every single Sunday, and sometimes at other times. So there's just a little bit of background here that I want to feed into the discussion, and then look in some detail at the text itself. The background is that people in the day of Jesus, Jewish people, actually for about 300 years before and for about 200 years later, believed that there would be a great moment of transformation when God would end the brokenness of this present age and replace it with a coming new world. And in those days, after a great military victory, an army, a monarch, the community would often have a great banquet to celebrate the victory. We know something about this ourselves. Now, in Judaism, they came to expect that after the great transformation, God would put on the banquet to end all banquets, that scholars sometimes call the Messianic banquet or the eschatological banquet. Eschatological is just one of those mouthful words. It means last days, the banquet that occurs after the last days. Or I like to think of it as the banquet celebrating the presence of the realm of God. So they expected this banquet to occur after the great moment of transformation. And we will see in just a minute that Mark has changed the timeline to a significant degree and brought something into relationship to the Lord's Supper that adds ever so much to our experience of taking that little piece of bread, even the delicious bread that Vicky Souders makes, and those little thimble cups of grape juice. So in the text itself, there is a great crowd, and they are in the wilderness. This is Mark's way of reminding the community that their existence in the year 70, even though many of them lived in urban areas, was still a wilderness existence, in the sense that they were on the edge of survival. There were threats all around. So this is Mark's way of saying the situation in this text is similar to the situation of your life. He called the disciples and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd because they do not have anything to eat." The word compassion is illuminating here. a word that is needed in every time and place. It comes from two Greek roots, which mean I feel and then with. To have compassion is to feel the world, to feel the experience of another. It is, as one of our North American sayings has it, to walk in somebody else's moccasins for a mile. To have compassion is to understand how the world feels to someone else and to act appropriately in response, in particular, helping improve ragged feelings. Jesus says, I have compassion. I feel what it's like to be in chaos. He knows what it is like when you are locked up in your house all day long. He knows what it is like when you sit outside the ICU waiting for your loved one who has COVID-19. He knows what it is like when you are on the edge of your life resources. And he says to them, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. This is underlining in the reader's ear, in the listener's ear, why Jesus couldn't just disperse them. It's because they were a long way from the resources that they need. His disciples, and remember in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are often anti-heroes. They are narrative characters that Mark paints in a negative way in order to prompt people to ask the question, how similar are we to the disciples? And if we are, how can we improve our life as disciples? They asked, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? They have been with him. He has given them authority. We talked about this the other day. He has given them authority to do what he does. In the strict sense, they don't need him to feed the crowd. They already have the power to do that. He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. Then he ordered them to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. A little side note here, I once read an article claiming that Jesus was the founder of modern management theory, because here he divides the crowd into small groups so that each group can be managed in a meaningful and non-chaotic way. But of course, if Jesus is called the father of modern management here, then that title would really need to go to Moses, who did the same thing with the children of Israel with the manna back in the book of Exodus. So this is a way, of course, of Mark emphasizing that God can do again in the time of Mark, in the chaos after the destruction of the temple, what God did in the wilderness when God fed Israel with the manna at 1,200 years before. Well, not that many, but many years before. And the existence of Judaism over those centuries is a witness to the power of God to sustain, to provide manna in every situation. They also had a few small fish, and blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. Now, this is pretty interesting because some of the texts in Jewish documents outside the Bible that describe this eschatological banquet, this realm of God banquet, picture it including bread and fish. In fact, one of those texts describes bringing up sea monsters and chopping them up and making them a part of the banquet. This, of course, is an indirect reference to the sea as a source, as a symbol for chaos, and the fish as inhabitants of the sea, This indicates that God can take that which is most threatening, the ocean, the sea, and the things that it brings forth, like fish and sea monsters, and transform them into things of blessing. But it has to happen at the hand of Jesus. So this is a way of saying, at one level, this story testifies to the fact that already in the time of Mark, in the midst of the chaos, God is giving them a foretaste of this last, final, climactic banquet of the realm of God. There will be a full taste, in Mark's mind, at the end of history, but now there are already, in the most unlikely circumstances, indications, signs of its promise. And this takes us to the second dimension and to the Lord's Supper and to the relationship of this story and the realm of God banquet to the Lord's Supper and to the question of how God provides this nourishment in the midst of chaos. There are 4 verbs here: took, blessed, broke, and gave. An intensive study by scholars has revealed that these 4 verbs are signals of the presence of the Lord's Supper. They are technical words that Jesus uses that the gospel writers use to describe what Jesus does at the Last Supper. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. The fact that these verbs occur here mean that in Mark's mind, the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, every time you partake of the loaf and the cup, is an experience of the eschatology, the banquet of the realm of God. That these 2 little things, this little piece of bread and this little cup, are physical signs that God gives you to impress upon your body, to impress upon your awareness that already God is at work in the realm. God is already at work in our moment in history, bringing about, working toward transforming the world. We, of course, must do our part. One reason for receiving the loaf and the cup is that it reminds us that Jesus has given us the power to be obedient to him, to do what he has asked us to do, which is to preach, teach, and organize or relate in ways that are consistent with the realm of God. And what I hope is that next Sunday, when we are together on Facebook Live and we partake of the loaf and the cup, you will think about how this small gesture is God's way of saying to you, you are part of a movement toward a transformed world, a movement that will never be extinguished because it has behind it the power of a living God.